should not be dismissed out of hand.
David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, I think a characteristic of the debate this evening has been the apparent unwillingness of the government to advance or defend its own legislation. The few contributions we have had have been notable by their volume rather than their substance. I listened particularly careful to the Minister's earlier contribution to this debate on Part 2. I look forward to the Minister explaining some of the opaque provisions of this bill, and because many of them are indeed opaque, and I'll particularly talk about this new Section 45Q in that context. The Minister, rather than address the substance and elucidate on this legislation, chose instead to give us a homily on the evils of indebtedness, which might have carried more weight had we not demonstrated repeatedly from the Greens, from Labor, that if this bill goes through, if we sell these assets, this country will be worse off. We will actually lose more than we gain. That is an absolute. We know this. The Minister then went on to express his concern about the situation in Greece. He had some strong feelings about the Portuguese health system. While I admire the Minister's breadth of interest and concern, I would rather he focus rather more tightly on New Zealand. If this bill passes, there will be a noticeable and measurable effect on New Zealanders' health. Already vulnerable households are struggling to pay their power bills. We know that the provisions of this bill, privatisation of these assets, will increase the cost of power to New Zealanders. We will see a knock-on effect in New Zealanders' health, and it is indefensible that the government is not willing to stand and persuade us otherwise, that this bill is a good idea, that New Zealanders will be better off economically, socially, or indeed environmentally. Mr Chair, I want to talk specifically about Part 2 and the proposed new 45Q, the Treaty of Waitangi provision or clause. It's interesting that a couple of the government contributions have been dismissive of references to the history of legislation in our New Zealand history. But I suspect in the original drafting of this bill, when the reference to the treaty was completely excluded from the new legislation, that perhaps somebody was remembering their history. Because recall that apparently benign Section 9 of the original State-Owned Enterprises Act of 1986, nobody, I suspect, thought it would do much harm putting it in there, something of a sop to Māori at the time. The Māori Council, of course, demanded a rather more robust interpretation of that clause, that Section 9 in the SOE Act, and that put a significant handbrake on the privatisation agenda of the 1980s. And I suspect the drafters of this bill had some cognizance of that and endeavoured to completely remove any reference to the treaty from this bill. There was an outcry against that, and quite rightly so. The government went searching for its support in Māori communities, and I know from experience one can spend a very long day in a Māori community searching for somebody who will speak in support of this bill, and you will search in vain. There is no support in Māoridom. The rather peculiar hybrid solution, if that's too strong a word, the response from the government is to insert this extremely strange clause that says nothing in this part shall permit the Crown to act in a manner that is inconsistent with the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, a very similar if not identical reference as in the original SOE bill. But it gets rather opaque, as I said after that. For the avoidance of doubt, subsection 1, which I've just recited, does not apply to persons other than the Crown. I would ask the Minister in the chair now, what is the intention of this clause? Is it the intention of this clause that these new mixed ownership model companies will not act in a way which is inconsistent with the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi? That question is answerable by a simple yes or no. And if the answer is yes, these companies, these new entities, will be obliged to act in a way that is consistent with the Treaty of Waitangi, with the principles of the treaty, then let it say that. I would challenge the Minister to support the SOP in my colleague Russell Norman's name that spells out very clearly, that would spell out very clearly, that these mixed ownership model companies would be obliged to act in a way which is consistent with the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. What is the alternative solution? That 51% of the time the mixed ownership model companies, well, Mr Chair,
David Clinton.
Thank you, Mr Chair. 51% of the time these new entities will act in a way that is consistent with the principle of the treaty. 49% of the time they will not. Does it mean that the government will assert its authority and insist that it must? But then why do we have this avoidance of doubt, this subpart 2? It absolutely makes no sense to me. I challenge the government to stand, take a call and explain what is the intention of this part. If it is that the companies will be bound by the principles, say that clearly. Do not hide behind this legal nonsense, this drafting nonsense that says you're going to create some strange hybrid creature, the majority of which will be obliged to act in consistency with the principles, the 49% will not. It makes absolutely no doubt. This is not a trivial issue. What are we talking about when we talk about the power companies, the solid energy? We're talking about companies with significant holdings in land and water. We are talking about companies that will have considerable influence over the well-being of our rivers, of our landscape. Solid energy, Mighty River Power. These are not trivial questions. How do Māori identify? They identify themselves by reference to a mountain and to a river. These companies, these new entities will be obliged to respect Māori relationships with awa, with maunga, 51% of the time, all of the time, never, because they will bow to the minority shareholders in a show of equity or who knows what. These are not trivial questions. What do the principles of the treaty actually talk about? This has never been finally demonstrated in law. Since 1987, it's been acknowledged the treaty is a living document, and similarly the principles have, they're subject to various interpretations. One constant in any definition of the principles of the treaty is a requirement of consultation, fair dealing, cooperation, partnership between the Crown and Māori. Are these new entities going to be bound by these principles? Will they be obliged to consult? Or can they simply point to this nonsense for the avoidance of doubt and say, oh no, we're not obliged to consult with Māori. We're not obliged to act in the way of a partnership. We are not obliged to cooperate with Māoridom when we are making decisions that have a direct and lasting impact on the rivers, on the well-being of the land, the people who live on it, on the landscapes. This makes no sense at all to me, and I invite and indeed challenge the government to explain to me what is the intention. Will or will not these new entities be bound?
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. The time has come for me to report progress.
The House has resumed. Mr Chairman.
Mr Speaker, the committee has considered the mixed ownership model bill and reports progress. Mr Speaker, I move that the report be adopted.
The question is that the report be adopted. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party vote. The clerk will well, I heard an aye and I'm a little bit closer than you. I will conduct a party vote. Thank you. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes opposed.
Green Party.
14 votes opposed.
New Zealand First.
8 votes opposed.
Maori Party.
3 votes in favour.
Mana.
1 vote opposed.
ACT New Zealand.
1 vote in favour.
United Future.
1 vote in favour.
The ayes are 64, the noes are 57. The report will be adopted. The motion is agreed to. So this bill is set down for further consideration in committee next sitting day, and the House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow. Good evening, everybody.